Welcome. I want to start out with a story because that just sounds way more fun, doesn't it? I think so. I want to bring you back to 10 years ago when I was in college. I don't look any different, okay, but a long time ago. And I'm sitting in my car in the Walgreens parking lot, and my memory is like really drastic. I don't actually think it was this bad, but it was like dark and rainy, and the parking light was on, and I'm sitting there, and I'm having a little conversation with Jesus because I had just found out that some of my friends were hanging out without me, which isn't like the end of the world, but it was happening like all that summer. And to top it off, these were my friends that I like introduced. Like they were my friend. I was like, you guys should meet. And then they were hanging out, and I find out they're hanging out, and it was happening all the time. It felt like that summer. And so me and Jesus were having a little conversation, and I was like, Jesus, I'm in for this ministry thing. I'll disciple. I got you. It's gonna be okay. But I'm done having friends because friends just disappoint. Have you ever felt that way? Ever felt like you were all alone and nobody really cared? Today we're going to talk about how loneliness and how it impacts our ability to love others. Because we're in this series called Won't You Be My Neighbor? And I think we should get on the same page about neighbor. When Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, I used to think it meant like your physical neighbor that you would see when you pull in your driveway. And that includes that. But when you read how Jesus talked about loving your neighbor, he was actually talking about the next person you encounter. Did you know that? So that includes the people that you see when you walk out today. It includes the barista who makes your coffee, the cashier at Aldi, your kid's soccer coach. It includes the next person you encounter. And when you lean in a little bit and you get to know them, you might have this idea that they have it all together, but when you lean in, you're going to find that a lot of people are lonely. People in this room. Everybody at some level has experienced loneliness or they're currently experiencing it. And it's actually becoming an epidemic. Like they call it relational poverty. And we might have this idea like, oh, those that are lonely are like the single people or people that live on their own. But it's an issue that social experts are naming that social poverty. It's different than material poverty. Material poverty is where we're lacking the essentials to get through the day. Relational poverty is lacking the intimacy and the connections to have a meaningful life. So you can have a job you can like the people you work with, but not really feel like you can open up to them. You could get the promotion, you could get the next level, and you could be the boss, but not have anybody to celebrate with. You could be a mom, a stay-at-home mom. You could have kids all around you all day long, but not feel like you have deep relationships with people. A college student, you're surrounded by people, you're going to class, you live with people in your dorm, and yet you don't feel like people see you. Some people, I think, feel that way when they go to church. They're not sure if there's people that care, people that they can trust to open up to. They don't know if people really notice them. And social experts say this is a problem in developing nations. And so in the West, it's becoming an issue. And they give 4 theories why this could be the case. The first one is the breakdown of family. So if somebody gets divorced, one person keeps the church, the other one has to find a new one person keeps those friends, the other one keeps those friends, and there's a breakdown in relationship. The second theory that they say is our culture's increased mobility, which gives us less time for relationships. People move, they get new jobs, they move to different states or countries, and that's not wrong, but if they don't make time for deep connections with friends, it gets lost in the transition. The third reason they give is a heavy workload, which gives less mental margin for relationships. The to-do list never ends. Have you noticed that? You ask people how they're doing, and they say, oh, I'm good, I'm just really busy. And if you don't make time for the friendships because it doesn't fit on the to-do list, then it just gets pushed to the side. And then the fourth theory that they say, which is all of our favorites, is the rise of social media. Don't we love that? I have a love-hate relationship. Part of me is like, oh, I can use this to point people to Jesus. And then the other part of me is like, whoa, this is like really distracting me from Jesus or making me feel worse about myself. And so it goes back and forth. But social experts say that social media gives us the idea that we are connected with lots of people. We know that they had a baby. We know they got engaged. We know they went on this trip. But we actually don't know how they're doing with that. You just had a baby? Well, how are you sleeping? You just went on a trip? Well, how'd it go? We haven't leaned in to ask how they're doing. Or we're lonely, so we post a picture. And we wonder, will anybody see it? Will anybody like it or comment or message me? And if they don't, it just confirms what we're already thinking. Nobody cares. And if they do, it only defers the loneliness. It doesn't actually meet the need of loneliness. That's what social experts say, and I would say that's probably true because it kind of lines up with the Bible, because really only Jesus is the one that can meet that. I'm 31, and for most of my 31 years, I've been single without a boyfriend. It's not currently the case, but it has been. And sometimes in the moments of being single, it was usually on a Saturday night, right before I was going to bed, when I was all alone and it was quiet. There'd be this thought that would knock in my head, and it would go, Alaina, you know you're nobody's first choice, right? And you can feel sorry, it's okay, because here's what would happen. In that moment, I would think about the lesson I learned as a little girl. And this is gonna sound really cheesy, so really prepare yourself. But it changed my life, okay? I would think about the lessons I learned as a little girl walking through these doors and going to Sunday school. We called it Sunday school, not Wonderland, back in the day. And my teacher would teach me this song. It went like this. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. And in the quiet of that moment, I would realize that Jesus picked me first. And not only did Jesus pick me first, he picked me first at my worst. You know what I'm saying? Like, it wasn't like I was on a date and all dressed up and like acting my best. Jesus knew all of my junk, and he still picked me. And he does the same for you. He picks us first. And I recognize that only Jesus could meet the need of my loneliness. A boyfriend, a husband could be great, but it would never be Jesus, and it could never complete me. And so I would realize this, and I would think about that song, For the Bible Tells Me So, and I'd go to the Bible. And I read things like this from Proverbs 11:25. It says, the generous will prosper, and those who refresh others will themselves be refreshed. Let's read that again. The generous will prosper, those who refresh others will themselves be refreshed. It's funny how the Bible works. It kind of gives you the opposite advice you'd expect. You don't have a lot of stuff, well, give it all away. You'll have everything you need. You want to live a full, abundant life? Well, die to self. You're lonely? Well, just make it about other people. It's as if the Bible is saying the cure for loneliness is to help others feel less lonely. The cure for loneliness is to help others feel less lonely. And so my hope today is that as we're talking, or people that are watching on Facebook, that God will put somebody on your heart that maybe you've overlooked. Maybe you've gone to work and you see them, but you don't know their name. Or it's a parent that you see when you drop your kids off, or somebody that's in your class. That God will put somebody on your heart to neighbor, to love like Jesus. And we're going to look at how Jesus loved, because he's the best example, I think. And we're going to look at three different ways from three different stories of how Jesus loved the lonely. You guys ready? All right, so here's the first one. How do we live out the cure for loneliness? By helping others feel less lonely. We love with touch. We're checking out the first story in Matthew 2:8. And it says, a man with leprosy came and knelt down before Jesus and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. And immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Now, leprosy is also known as Hansen disease, and you should look that up when you get home. Google the images. You need to mentally know that, be aware to do that, so that's why we didn't show you that, but I'm going to do my best to explain what leprosy was. When this man knelt down and stated, he didn't ask, did you notice that? He knew God could heal him, and he stated that. He looked like somebody who had lumps all over his body, lumps that were full of pus, and they weren't small, they were big. His voice probably sounded very different because leprosy would change your vocal cords. He was probably missing some fingers or some limbs because leprosy would make your body start decomposing. And his face was probably inflamed, very large. He probably looked more like an animal than a human. In addition to that, there were all these laws that people with leprosy had to follow, what they could and could not do. And there were all these laws that people without leprosy could and could not do around somebody with leprosy, okay? And part of that was they didn't even live in the town. So this man had been alone. And when people had leprosy, they had it for up to 10 years. So who knows how long it had been since he had been near someone. And when he knelt down by Jesus, if Jesus was like everybody else, Jesus could have backed away. And he still could have healed them, because lots of times Jesus spoke words and healed people, right? He brought Lazarus back from the dead by speaking words. He could have been like, you're healed, now go take a bath. But instead, Jesus leaned in and touched the man. Because the man wanted to be healed, Jesus knew he needed to be touched. There's a lot of people that come to church week after week, and they like Pastor Carter's messages, and they like the music and the people, but the reason they come so consistently is church is one of the only places where they get a hug or a high five or a fist bump. I said fist bump at the first. Keep saying it wrong. You know what I mean, okay? Church is one of the only places where they get a hug. I was talking to a Level Ground parent. Level Ground's our youth group that we have for 6th through 12th grade on Thursday night at 6:30. You should go. And I was asking this parent how, if you're a teenager, if you're an adult, you can be a leader. But I was asking this parent how their student liked Level Ground. And I text him, and you got to know with Level Ground, like, it's not like we just show up and everything works out. There's a lot of people that make it happen. Somebody is working on the message all week. The band does the music, which they work on that too. Somebody comes for setup. They also clean up. There's somebody that comes for registration. Leaders come a half hour early every week for a meeting. There's emails. There's lots and lots of details that make Level Ground happy. And when this mom asked her daughter, how'd you like Level Ground? She said, oh, it was good. Alaina hugged me. That was her highlight of Level Ground. And I was reminded, there's a lot of people that hug people, I just happened to be the one to hug her that day. I was reminded that people leave remembering how you made them feel. And it's not wrong to plan awesome events and put detail into that, but that's what people remember. And so if we want to love like Jesus, we got to love with touch. And you'll find that often on all 4 Gospels, there's lots of stories where Jesus healed people with touch when he didn't necessarily have to. And I just want you to know, if you're like me, I'm actually really not a touchy person. When teenagers are around, I just can't help it. But for most people, I'm like, hey, like it doesn't even occur to me to give a hug, right? But going back to how Jesus loved, we want to read enough. We don't have to like be awkward. I'm not saying that. We want to like get to know them enough to know if that's what they need. The cure for loneliness is to help others feel less lonely. So we love with touch, and we love by listening. Now, if you're a big sister like I am, you might have thought that should have said we love by lecturing, right? Like, I know what your problem is. Let me just tell you so you can fix it. I got 3 younger brothers, and this is us on Easter morning. We spent all night getting ready for this, as you can tell. We slept, we got up, we took this picture all night. It's Easter morning, Easter baskets, and I grew up with them, and one of the things that did not come very natural was to listen to them. Like they didn't even tell me what the problem was. I would just try to solve it for them. But when we go back to how Jesus lived his life, he did a lot of listening. Did you notice that Jesus asked a lot of questions when he's talking to people? He wants to meet people right where they're at. One of the things I found when people listen is that they find they have a lot more in common with people than they assume. You can see people like, oh, our backgrounds are different, our political views are different. We don't have anything in common. But when you start to listen to people, you start realizing you're on way more level ground than you thought, because you both need Jesus a lot. Jesus, we're going to look at the one story. He did this a lot, but we're going to look at one story where he listened to people, and it's about these 2 guys on the road to Emmaus. And they're walking along, and Jesus had just died a couple days ago. And they were bummed, disappointed. They didn't know what to do, because in their narrative, Jesus was the Messiah. And the Messiah, what they thought, was going to come and build his kingdom here. And that meant he was the Messiah. Jesus was going to kick the Romans' butt. The Romans were not good guys. They persecuted the Jews. And they thought that Jesus was going to show them who's boss. But then Jesus died. And they didn't know what to do with this information. And it had been a couple days, and they're walking along. And for some reason, Jesus decides to keep it on the DL that he's actually Jesus. So he's talking to them, and they don't know it. And here's what we find. Jesus said to them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem today who does not know the things that have happened?" "What things?" Jesus said. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all people." Now, when Jesus said what things, he could have been like all the 6th grade boys I know, and would have been like, instead of saying what things, he could have said, "Psych, it's me." You know? Like, that literally would have been a perfect opportunity to pull the best prank ever. And he also could have just said, hey, it's me, and here's the game plan. Here's what we're going to do. It's going to be okay. And they did figure that out, that it was Jesus, and they did start figuring out that ultimately everything was going to be all right. All right. It was going to be okay. But Jesus showed us that it's important to meet people where they're at, because a lot of times, have you noticed this? They don't actually want your advice. I can't picture why not. But a lot of times they just want to listen. We have a youth leader named Dion Ringer, and he's awesome. And I've been working with him for a while. And one of the things I've noticed about Dion is it doesn't matter what kind of teen, what kind of background, what kind of, like, their hobbies are. Teens are always talking to Dion. I'll walk in the room, there's another teen just talking away. And I've realized that Dion is being like Jesus because his secret sauce for all of this is he listens. If you have people in your life, maybe God's putting somebody on your heart, and you're like, but I don't know how to solve their problem. Like, if we had coffee, like, they're going to tell me all this stuff, and I don't know what to do. I just want you to know, all you have to do is listen and remember that God's the one that solves the problems. God's the one that does the redeeming and the saving and the healing. And all we get to do when we say yes to Jesus, when we say yes to the people God puts on our heart, we get a front row seat for that time to see God work. That's what we get to do when we love like Jesus, when we love our neighbor, when we love the lonely. The cure for loneliness is to help others feel less lonely. So we love with a loving touch, and we love by listening, and we love with time. You can't do any of that without time. Jesus had 3.5 years of ministry, and there were 12 guys that he invested in during that time. There was places that he was going. A lot of times he was on the move. But what you'll notice when you read how Jesus lived his life was that there was a lot of people that interrupted him. A lot of people came across his path, and Jesus treated them like divine appointments. He didn't treat them like I don't have time for this. Have you ever felt like there's people in your life that don't have time for you, and you didn't know what to do with that? I just want to remind you today that Jesus always has time for you. He always has time for you. So we look at what Jesus did. He invested in the 12, but a lot of times when he would have conversations with people, they would leave their life completely changed. That's why I just want to remind you, when you say yes to Jesus and it's a coffee, like, it might just be a coffee, and that might be a time where you can encourage them to go back to God's word or just listen. But you can just be a part of their life for that time. Jesus did it all the time. We're going to look at a story where Jesus had just found out that John the Baptist had died, and John the Baptist was his cousin, and he was one of the very few people that got the whole gig for why Jesus was on the planet, and now he was gone. And I'm guessing Jesus felt pretty lonely. And we read, when Jesus heard what had happened, that John the Baptist had died, he withdrew by a boat privately to a solitary place, and hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. When evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the village and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat." And Jesus was given some fish and some loaves of bread, and he miraculously multiplied that to feed the thousands. And the most impressive part about that story is that Jesus made the time to do it. It was not on the agenda. It was not on the schedule to pause. And he definitely, I'm sure, did not feel like pausing and stopping to talk with these people. But he made the time. I also want you to know that as you read the story, you'll notice that Jesus didn't stick around. He didn't camp out for a month and check in and make sure everybody was happy. He continued on with his mission of what he was doing. It's important to note that allowing yourself to be interrupted does not mean you become permanently responsible for someone. I'm going to read that one more time. Allowing yourself to be interrupted does not mean you become permanently responsible for someone, because Jesus is the one that does the healing. And I also want you to know, because I got to remember this, is that Jesus doesn't have to ask you if he can interrupt your schedule. Did you realize that? I've come to recognize that when something happens and I'm like, I don't know how to do this, I just have to ask Jesus, Lord, how do you want me to reach out to them? How do you want me to rearrange my schedule? And I don't always get that right. But when I do, I recognize that he really is in control and he can handle my schedule. When I was in high school, I was your normal high school kid that wanted my independence, that was worried about what I was going to do after high school, what college I was going to go to, and had my guy issues. And there was this woman named Teresa that started mentoring me. She started taking me to Starbucks. Sometimes we'd go through a book. I blame her for my Starbucks addiction, so started with that. But a lot of times, Teresa would just live life with me. I'd go to the grocery store with her. I remember once going to the dentist with her, very random, but I think she just had to pick something up. So one time on a Wednesday night, she took me to Olive Garden, and I was feeling like royalty. Teresa, I'm sure, gave me awesome advice. Do we show the picture of her? This is her. This was us on a mission trip. I'm sure she gave me awesome advice. Unfortunately, I don't remember it, which is a little awkward. But what I remember is that I would share with Teresa what was going on, and she would refocus my vision on the fact that I just needed to keep it about Jesus. And I would walk away feeling heard, feeling loved, and being reminded that Jesus is the only one that's never going to leave me. Teresa, she was married, she had kids, her husband owned his own business. I lived like a half hour away. It was not convenient for her to invest in me. She didn't have that kind of example in high school either. She was just saying yes to Jesus. She was just being obedient to what God was calling her to do in that moment for that season. Because a lot of times it's just for a season. I think sometimes we can start thinking like, well, people should thank us more, or we should get more gratitude. But when we recognize like we're just saying yes and being obedient to what God's calling us to do, then we have the freedom to let go because God's the one that's never going to leave them. And when I was a freshman in college, it was a no-brainer. I wanted to sign up to be a youth leader because I wanted to be a Teresa to somebody. That's why I got started with this whole youth ministry gig, because I wanted to be a Teresa to somebody. Andy Stanley says, do for one what you wish you could do for all. You can't meet all the needs of the world, but you can meet a relational need for someone today. The cure for loneliness is to help others feel less lonely. So what's God want you to do? He wants you to lean in with a loving touch and a listening ear and to take the time to do that. But maybe you're sitting there and you're like me in the Walgreens parking lot. You're like, Lord, I'll do your work, but I don't want to deal with your people because they just disappoint. Because that's how I felt. And after I got done telling Jesus how I felt about ministry and people and friends, it was quiet. And in that moment, I realized and was thinking about all the times that I knew Jesus completed me. I knew I needed him, but I was like, but I'm going to be happy. I'll be happy when I know what college I go to. Jesus, I know you're great and all, but I'm going to be really great when I know I'm popular or when I'm that person's best friend. And it was in that moment that I realized if Jesus didn't give up on me on all the countless times that I had put him aside as my second choice or third or fourth, if Jesus didn't give up on me, he was going to help me not give up on others. Because when Jesus completes us, when he defines us, it makes it a lot easier to love our neighbor. If you're a mom and dad here today, and every day, every week, every month, you're trying to teach your kids the same thing, but you're telling them that Jesus loves them, when you're teaching your kids that, you are giving them life-changing information. If you're a Wonderland teacher or youth leader, and every week you show up, and you're telling them about Bible stories, and you're helping them think through, what do you think about that? Every week, you're giving them the foundation that they need when they're older, and when they feel alone, you're reminding them that they really never are, because Jesus never leaves them. Proverbs 11 says, the generous will prosper, and those who refresh others will themselves be refreshed. The cure for loneliness is to help others feel less lonely. When we love our neighbor, we are treating people like divine appointments. And the sky is the limit to the possibility, because we're pointing them to the God who does the impossible. Will you pray with me? Lord, I pray for those that have felt the sting of rejection and they don't know how they could ever get over that, Lord. We know that you're the only one that can fulfill that need. You're the only one that completes and defines us. I pray for all of us that we would look at this week as opportunities to love our neighbor, that when interruptions come, we would look at them like divine appointments. Lord, that I pray that you would bless those conversations. You would help us to know what they need in that moment so that they ultimately get that what they're looking for is Jesus. We pray that you get all the glory. Amen.